The views and opinions expressed on Explorers Secrets of the Truth or that of their guests or contributors are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. All information on Explorers Secrets of the Truth is provided in good faith. However, we make no representation or warranty of any kind, express or implied, regarding the accuracy, adequacy, validity, reliability, availability, or completeness of any information on this talk show or website.
From monsters and ghosts to otherworldly beings, join the explorers as they venture into the darkest realms, seeking the truth to what goes bump in the night.
Good evening and welcome to Explorers Secrets of the Truth, episode 78.
Did you freeze?
No, you froze. I'm not froze.
Oh, there you are.
So,
All right.
Good evening and welcome to Explorers.
Well, start over if you have to.
Yeah, I don't know where I was. So, good evening. Welcome to Explorers Secrets of the Truth, episode 78. Sit down, relax, shake off the normal world, and journey with us to the other realms of possibility. Tonight, as always, I'm joined by my best friend and co-host, Les Cabbage. Come with us as we explore and seek the truth about this world. How are you doing this evening, Les?
I'm not too bad, buddy. How about you?
Technical issues, but it's normal.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure.
Yep.
So I guess I will just tell everybody where it could be reached. I'll tell you what, the lag is really bad tonight. So I apologize in advance for those who tune in and listen. We're kind of stepping on top of each other here because the internet is just horrible tonight. But for those of you who can hear and can tune in, you could join us live every other Tuesday on Facebook and YouTube. Comment underneath and hopefully, providing no errors or issues, the comments will populate on our back end and we could answer you guys live. You can find us at our website at www.explorersgroup.com. You can find us on Twitter or X at Explorers Group. And we are also on all the major podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Audible, Spotify, you name it, we're out there. And all that we ask is if you follow us on Facebook, please hit the follow button. If you watch us on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you're listening to us in podcast world, please give us a 5-star review to help us with the rankings. And that ends that.
Thank you, Les. That was riveting. So tonight we're going to talk about some legendary stories, focusing on one in particular, kind of the weird science of World War II. And we're going to talk about some hard fact and, some interesting stories that really could 100% just be science fiction. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was made into a movie that was 100% science fiction. Actually, it was made into a movie series.
So where are we going to start with this one then?
Oh, well, let's talk about what was known as Project Rainbow or Project Invisibility. And this is we're going to give the facts on this part of it, or the alleged facts to this part of it. This is most commonly known as the Philadelphia experiment.
Yeah, the Philadelphia experiment was an alleged event claimed to have been witnessed by an ex-merchant mariner named Carl M. Allen at the United States Navy's Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And sometime around October 28th, 1943, Allen described an experiment where the U.S. Navy attempted to make a destroyer escort, the SS Eldridge, disappear and the bizarre results that follow.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people probably have heard of this either from the many shows that have come out over the years about it, or like I mentioned earlier, the movie series that started back in 1984 and continues off and on to this day, starring Michael Parr, who was Eddie from Eddie and the Cruisers fame. Here's a little tidbit of special information. He was also the first cover model in 1987 for Men's Fitness.
You know, the weird stuff that we learned from Professor Chad during these shows. Like, why do you know these things?
You know, I don't know if it's a blessing or if it's a curse. But also, thank you for using my proper title when addressing me and my vast amount of knowledge. That is actually the title, folks. Professor of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So professor is fine when you're speaking to me or asking me questions.
Oh, geez.
Since I am actually, last time I checked, the only one on staff here at Xplorers, I have a big credentials poster over here that says I'm a professor.
That's true.
I would like to be addressing that from now on.
And we have Norm joining us tonight. Good to see you, Norm. Oh, and Cindy just popped in. Thanks for tuning in, Cindy. Hello to you too. So, and back to the case at hand. The first mention of this project comes from Carl M. Allen, which I believe we had one of his pictures. Yes.
No,
we don't. Okay, no, we don't have his picture. Allen was an American merchant mariner who claimed that during World War II, he witnessed the Philadelphia experiment, a supposed paranormal event where the United States Navy made a ship invisible and accidentally teleported it through space and time. The story is widely understood to be a hoax perpetuated by Allen, something he confessed to several times over the years, then recanted on that. Then he confessed again, which is very weird.
Yeah, kind of. As we go into this, like I said, you and I had talked off air about this, and I believe the possibility that we were trying something like this, but I don't necessarily believe the whole story. So,
right.
This version of the story, now we're going to go into a couple versions of the story. This version of the story surfaced in late 1955 when Allen sent a book full of handwritten annotations referring to the experiment the U.S. Navy Research Organization had conducted, and a series of letters further claims to a UFO book writer. Allen claimed to have witnessed the experiment while serving aboard the SS Andrew Firthis. In Allen's account, a destroyer escort was successfully made invisible, but the ship inexplicably teleported to Norfolk, Virginia for several minutes and then reappeared in the Philadelphia shipyard. The ship's crew was supposed to have suffered various side effects, including insanity, intangibility, and being frozen in place.
Yeah, when Jessup wrote back requesting more information to corroborate his story, Allen said his memory would have to be recovered and referred Jessup to what seems to be like a non-existent Philadelphia newspaper article that Allen claimed covered the incident. And in 1957, Jessup was invited to the Oval Office, to the Office of Naval Research. I am not able to read tonight. And where he was shown the annotated copy of his book. Jessup noticed the handwriting of the annotations resembled the letters he received from Allen. So he's trying to piece those pieces of the puzzle together there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do not believe that the Naval Research Office is oval. I've never been in it, but I don't think it is oval. I think there's only one or two.
My eye just read oval for some reason. I guess it just made naval oval. I don't know.
Yeah. It happens. We'll give you one of these.
I'm getting it. There we go. I'm
not the only one.
For the night.
Yep. So, about 12 years later, Allen would say that he had authored all the annotations in order to scare the hell out of Jessup. Now, why he picked a man who was writing, UFO novel, like UFO covering UFOs, not even necessarily ufology, but he just happened to pick this one guy, makes up this elaborate, story and makes all these notes and includes all this like background information and all this stuff. So there were two officers at the Office of Naval Research, a Captain Sidney Sherby and a Commander George W. Hoover, who had taken a personal interest in the matter. Hoover later explained that his duty as a special projects officer required him to investigate many publications and that he had ultimately found nothing of substance to the alleged invisibility experiment. So Hoover discussed the annotations with Anton, president of Vero Manufacturing Corporation of Garland, Texas, during a meeting about Varro's contract work with the Office of Naval Research. And another little tidbit of funny information is Zombieland starts in Garland, Texas.
Yeah, the movie.
Yeah, he's in Garland. That's what he says about being in Garland. And the funny thing is, honest to God, I've been to Garland. That's what it looks like normally.
Really?
Yeah, it looked like it did in Zombieland.
Oh, geez.
Really.
Great movie, though.
Yeah, great movies, both of them. Stanton became so interested in that Varro's office began producing mimeograph copies of Jessup's book with the annotations and Allen's letter. The first dozen and eventually 127 total copies. And these copies became known as the Varro edition. Besides noting the handwriting of the individual named Jemmy, addressed as such by others using blue ink, the anonymous introduction to the I'm trying to read these notes. Yeah,
we got the second Schwarzenegger of the night.
Yep. So the Varro edition concludes that there were two other individuals making annotations: a Mr. A, identified as Allen by Jessup, in blue ink, and Mr. B in blue-green ink. So now we have another group that's just basically making fraudulent copies of this, these annotations in this book and selling them. So then Jessup tried to publish more books on the subjects of UFOs, but was unsuccessful. He lost his publisher and experienced a succession of downturns in his personal life. And of course, there's one way all these people die. And it's always mysteriously. So he dies by suicide in Florida on April 30th, 1959. Oops, excuse me.
It always makes me wonder, how all these people. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm jumping over the lag again.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I just think it's so funny how all these people that have any kind of involvement in any kind of government-related situations always end up mysteriously committing suicide. And they were always like normal, sane people, no other issues, no indication whatsoever to point them in that direction, but yet they always mysteriously die by some sort of suicidal event or some kind of freak accident.
Yeah, his from what I remember, his suicide was he was in a park, like in a parking lot of a park, and had run a hose from his exhaust pipe in through the back window and then closed all the other windows and started the car.
Oh my God.
Not a very uncommon thing to like for suicides, to be done that way. Now,
right.
Various book writers who had tried to get more information from Carl Allen found his responses very elusive, and some couldn't even find him at all at that point. And one of the reporters from Allen's hometown of New Kingston, Pennsylvania, interviewed his family and was handed a pile of documents and books, all scribbled with Allen's annotations. They described Allen as a fantastic mind, but also a drifter and a master leg puller.
that's the other thing too. Is there's these people that there's corroborations with UFO authors. There's these tricksters and pranksters, and a lot of this stuff really. To go back to your point about it being fictitious or science fiction, there's too many red flags here where the people just their credibility doesn't hold up in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? And their associations with the people that they're trying to get involved with. I mean, they're trying to push a book. You know what I mean? So this is quite a story that could very easily sell. So I mean, it's just a lot of red flags so far.
Yeah,
and we do have Kelly and OS joining in as well tonight. So thanks for joining in, guys, and good to see you. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I believe that we may have been working on some similar ideal project. I don't necessarily think Alan's version of it is what was actually going on or what actually happened. Because again, like, we had said he pointed the author to a newspaper article that nobody seems to be able to find.
Right.
Now, I've worked for a newspaper. I know how the archive system is. You can't say to the newspaper company, say, I need, October 29th, 1943, the whole paper. There is somewhere in an archive that newspaper. Now, nowadays it might be digitized, it might be on some kind of film, but it existed somewhere. We're talking in the 1950s, only say 14 years later, or say 16 years later. Hey, I'm trying to find this edition of your paper. I need some references from an article, and the newspaper turn around and say, "Oh, we don't have that." I mean, I remember when we, I don't know if you ever worked up there at Pottsville Republican when we did the security for them.
No.
Oh, you used to go down the basement, and I used to be able to pull newspapers from like the 1940s out of the archives. I mean, I remember looking at the Jimmy Hoffa stuff in that archive, like going down there and just being able to page through them. That's the nice thing about doing security when nobody's around. You can go look in archives. But yeah, I mean, so this is only 16 years. I'm talking in late 1990s, early 2000s. I could get papers all the way back to the 50s in a podunk little town in Pennsylvania's, archives. So this guy's already saying, like, 16 years later, a Philadelphia newspaper. So you got to figure it's like the Inquirer or one of the major newspapers in Philly. Also, think about this weird thing. Why would a top secret government project be covered by the newspaper at all?
Very good point.
So he's already leading you
top
down.
Secret. It's not going to be public information.
Exactly. He's already leading, and this author went, looking for this paper. Well, dude, if this is a classified government project, it's classified. It's not going to be in the newspaper. It's not going to show up in, that evening's edition. It's the middle of a war. Also, you're talking 1943. We are in the middle of World War II.
True.
October. I'm trying to think. I mean, the war had basically turned somewhat in continental Europe by that point. I mean, we were. I'm trying to think of the pocket at Stalingrad was still holding out at that point. I mean, you're talking October, so yeah, it's probably still right around the time Paulus surrenders the 6th Army in Stalingrad. So the war hasn't completely even started going our way yet. We're not going to be putting this stuff out in newspapers in Philadelphia. Also in Pennsylvania, where we have a high German ethnicity, and was one of the worries was the the fact that we had German POWs that were allowed to leave the POW camps and go work on farms locally.
Jesus.
Some of them didn't come back all the time.
I could imagine.
And even some of them stayed on after the war with those families and, worked for them and stuff like that. So this is where the stories start to kind of unravel at times.
Yeah. Well, before we go on any further, for those of you who just might be tuning in, we want to remind you all that we go live every other Tuesday on Facebook and on YouTube, as we are right now. You can comment under the show, as many people have been doing tonight. I'm getting comments from YouTube and Facebook, so we could get back to you guys live during the show. You could find us on Twitter or X at Explorers Group, at our website, explorersgroup.com. And we are on all the major podcast providers. And all that we ask is follow us on Facebook, like and subscribe on YouTube. And while you're listening to us on whatever podcast provider it may be, give us a 5-star review so we can get ourselves bumped up there in the rankings. So back to you, Chad.
Yes, thank you. Again, that was so riveting.
Mm-hmm.
You make it so interesting.
I know. I say it multiple times a show every other week, and I still have to sit there and do I remember everything? I forget half of it. Sadly.
I do it with the intro too, so don't feel bad. And I wrote the damn thing.
I know.
You think I would remember it? So now we're going to tell a different version of the story. Okay. And this version of the story, honestly, was the first version of the story that really struck me as parts of it could be 100% fact.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of it could 100% be science fiction. So we're going to start telling the story of Edward Cameron and his brother Duncan Cameron. So basically, if you can pull up that A. Cameron photo.
Yes.
Okay. This is Duncan and Edward's father, Albert Cameron. And he was a career Navy officer and then later was in the U.S. Coast Guard. So this man does definitely exist. And after the war, he definitely had some connections to basically what was the forerunner of the CIA, and then later possibly had some government connections, still worked for one of the 3-letter acronym groups. But his sons were born about a year apart to 2 different women. He was quite the ladies' man, according to his one son. So they both grow up, and they spent most of their time with their aunt, because the father being away and the mother's kind of dropping them with the one aunt. And the aunt is actually from a relatively famous family. So she definitely exists. And the family business was in existence until a couple of years ago. So there was definitely a Cameron family, and this aunt does definitely exist. So Edward Cameron basically finishes up his degree right before World War II breaks out. His brother, same deal. Both of them get PhDs in physics.
Mm-hmm.
They, of course, because of their father, are put right into the military out of their PhD programs. They do their 90-day wonder kid officers candidate school. They're both sent out on tours on ships and then brought back to Princeton University to the Institute for Advanced Studies there. When they come back there, they realize that they're going to be working on some projects for the government. And one of the projects is, now this is already in 1942-ish they're brought in. They missed Pearl Harbor by magically somehow being on leave in San Francisco, even though their ship was at Pearl Harbor, that the Pennsylvania was in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. But they had been in San Francisco and were held in San Francisco and not allowed back to Hawaii until after the bombing. Don't know if that plays into Dad's, being a career military officer and the not even conspiracy theory, the fact that we knew they were going to attack. We just kind of allowed some of it to happen so we could get into the war. So these two are then transferred to Princeton. When they're at Princeton, they are working with gentlemen like, pop up the photo, Les, Nicholas Tesla. Nikolai. Gentlemen like him, and then Van Neumann. Other photo.
Which one was that one? That was, hold on.
Yes. Dr. Van Neumann. So they're basically briefed on this Project Rainbow. And what Project Rainbow is a way for us to make ships basically invisible to the Germans. At this point, we're still losing tons of freight in the Atlantic, trying to cross over to England to supply England and the D-Day invasion. So we're looking for a way to make ships basically invisible. Now, the question that's always bounced back and forth is invisible to the naked eye or invisible to like sonar and radar. And of course, you get two different answers depending on what time you hear this story. Right. Yeah. So the initial is, sonar and radar are not that highly advanced at that point, but that was the real goal, was to kind of blur the lines on those returns so they could get the ships past the U-boats, the wolf packs of U-boats. Now, of course, if we go in and think about Tesla, this is a man who at one point claimed he had talked to aliens. He had built a radio and talked to aliens. I'd also like to point out something. The common misconception is Marconi invented the radio. Marconi did not invent the radio. Tesla invented the radio, but Tesla's radios were wired to each other. Marconi invented the antenna and the receivers. So he actually didn't invent the radio. Again, you're welcome. So while they're working on this project, Tesla believed that he could bend time. They do a test run of this on a small scale back in about, allegedly, according to the story that Edward Cameron, and I'm going to tell you why this becomes very sketchy here. The story that Edward Cameron is told is back in 1933. On a small scale, this project actually worked, and that's why the government, FDR, basically gives it the go-ahead. He was a friend of Tesla's and stuff like that, and kind of felt like it was something that could work, and Tesla thought it could work on a large scale. But as they're going along, Tesla starts to have second thoughts about this. They, of course, it's the middle of a war. They're pushing now. Tesla, again, too, is also a guy who created a death ray. He created a great number of military weapons that, some countries we didn't want and other countries bought. Not sure they actually worked, but, he did use a lot of early sound weapons and stuff like that. So now he figures out this way of creating a fluctuating pulse using Tesla coils, of course, and getting them into sequence will actually cause this effect that they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So in about 1942, early 43, the government says we need a full-scale test of this. So Tesla says, okay, fine, let's retrofit. We need a ship to do it with. So they bring in the Eldridge, which at the time was just finished being built, had done its sea trial or was about to do its sea trial. So they bring it into Philly. When they bring it in, they gut it, a lot of stuff out of it. They put all these components, these coils, these motors, these controls, and then they tether a ship to it. And they flick all the switches, and it kind of sort of works. So, of course, the government's like, yep, we're going to do this. Let's full steam ahead on it, full live test. By this is also where this other story doesn't match up. It's got to be done on August 15th, 1943. So Tesla again is having all the second thoughts about it, and he realizes that if he takes these coils out of sequence, out of phase, it will actually work, but not completely, and it won't do any kind of craziness. So they go to run this test earlier than August 15th. Mm-hmm. Tesla takes it out of sequence, though. He purposely sabotages the experiment. It kind of sort of works. The government says, look, something's not right about what you just did. He steps aside. Van Neumann takes over. Van Neumann realizes Tesla sabotaged him. He never said it, but he realizes it. He realizes the frequency wasn't quite right. It was, seconds or two off in the phasing, so therefore it wasn't getting the full effect. So he goes back, redesigns the whole system. Government says this time you need to have a crew on the ship when you do it. So the two science officers picked are Edward and Duncan Cameron to be on the ship while it's going on. They're going to run all from the ship. Mm-hmm. Get out to the harbor. They start throwing all the switches. Everything's working. All of a sudden, the observers from another ship, all they can see is this green mist form around the Eldridge. Mm-hmm. And then it disappears. Now, Edward Cameron says when this green mist formed, they went to look down off the boat for the water line, and the water line was gone. There was no water under them. It was black. And all they could see was this green mist. And they basically started going through a wormhole. And as they're going through the wormhole, two sailors decide to jump off the ship. And according to Edward Cameron, they disintegrate. Just instantly disintegrate. So him and his brother Duncan are trying to shut this down, stop the process. They can't figure it out. The machine won't shut off. So they are traveling through this wormhole. So finally, they decide to jump. When they jump, though, they end up in Montauk, New York in 1983 at Camp Hero. Now, you guys that are familiar with Stranger Things, Camp Hero is basically the basis for most of the whole Stranger Things universe. I've never seen it, but I just know enough about the correlation between the two. They end up there. Well, they're caught by military personnel, brought into a room, questioned on who they are. Mm-hmm. They say, Petty Officer Duncan Cameron, this is, Ensign whatever, Edward Cameron. Guy said, okay, wait here. They bring in the 75-year-old man, and he says, who are you? And they tell him again who they are, and he goes, no, you're not. You can't be. They then realize they're talking to Dr. Van Neumann, just much older than what he was when they last saw him. So they start telling him details about what they were working on. Not in the sense of not classified information, but stuff that only he and people on the team would have been privy to, some inside jokes, some stuff like that. So he all of a sudden realizes, oh, you really are them.
Right.
So somehow they open up this rift to 1983. And this is basically, if you've ever seen the movie, kind of, the movie has them ending up in like Nevada. So it seems like Area 51 or, Los Alamos, something like that. But they actually went to Camp Hero, which is at Montauk, New York.
Yeah, which for many of you listening probably realized Montauk Monster, the whole, was it Plum Island?
Plum Island's off the coast there, off Montauk a little ways. But Camp Hero is actually, you can actually go to Camp Hero. I've seen some weird stuff. We've had before on one of the Bigfoot episodes, I believe. But Camp Hero is one of those places that is, since about 1996, is closed. Operationally closed. It is open to the public because it's part of a national or state park. But the buildings, none of the military structures have been torn down. And there's vent pipes that go to some of the underground works. And people have dropped microphones down these vents and hear diesel engines running in abandoned...
No way.
They have, you can find them on YouTube, like actual audio of a diesel engine you can hear running in a quote unquote closed military facility that has no personnel at it. And we also don't know how much of it is actually underground. That's one of the other things. So people have found this kind of stuff and have went out there, and they've even made movies about the whole like Montauk, thing. But get back to the Philadelphia experiment part of it. When they come through, there's a thing called the Montauk chair. And it's, if you've ever seen Preston Nichols describe it, if you have a degree in electric engineering, please let me know if any of it makes sense to you, because 3 seconds into it, I'm just googly-eyed staring at him. It's not my specialty. This chair supposedly is part of a mind control experiment, which is what Montauk is allegedly part of. They have big wide array radar dishes there. Is supposedly a coastal defense site. People claim, though, the dishes at times weren't turned towards the Atlantic Ocean. They were actually turned towards New York City. So again, this is much like a few of these Russian experiments on mind control back at the same time. They build these large spectral array radar systems, and then magically people see them not facing the direction they should be. At this time, there's such a large homeless teenage boy population in Manhattan, New York, stuff like that. And a lot of kids go missing. The thought is they were brought to Montauk, programmed, used for missions, used for different operations and stuff like that. Nobody would miss them because they were homeless, vagrant type kids. So if they go missing, there's, a family was looking for them, already for 2 years at that point, and nobody knew that they were in New York City. If they disappear from New York City and end up dead in California, and they finally identify him, it's like, oh, somehow he got to California. Hitchhiked, whatever it was. So this is all going on. Well, Duncan Cameron allegedly can interface naturally with this chair. So they use Duncan for a while, and they eventually get to the point where they realize they have to send the two of them back.
Mm-hmm.
So they create a portal there in Montauk, and they jump through the portal. They end up back on the Eldritch right at the time, within seconds of them jumping off. They figure out Van Neumann told them how to shut it down while they were in Montauk. So when they go back, they figure out how to take it out of sequence, shut it down. Everything should stop. Well, they go back, they shut it down. It ends up reappearing in Philadelphia in the naval yard, except for missing 2 sailors. There were 15 injured sailors. Also, some of the sailors were just running around nonsensical, and they said the ones on the deck had it the worst.
Mm-hmm.
When they were on the deck being exposed to whatever they were exposed to caused some mental issues, long-term, cancer issues. The ones in the ship fared better, but this is where the story of people fused to parts of the ship. So like their arm was part of the ship now. Like they were stuck to the ship via their arm. Yeah.
That's so freaking weird.
Now, here's the problem. You cannot find a record for an Edward Cameron, and you cannot find a military record for a Duncan Cameron. You know how we know this whole story?
How?
Pop up Al Bielek.
I will right now.
That gentleman's name is Al Bielek. Al Bielek had always had an interest in the Philadelphia experiment. Also claims to have helped Ivan T. Sanderson investigate the Philadelphia experiment when he did his work on it. Al Bielek had served at some point in the military during World War II, went to school, has a degree in like electrical engineering, is not, some advanced physicist, but has a very vast knowledge of physics. So he's attending conferences and talks and like lectures and stuff like that with the authors of these different books, and he even goes on to write a book about it. He meets Preston Nichols, and Preston Nichols says, starts talking to him and says, there's something more to what you're saying. You know a lot about this that isn't public, knowledge. It's not being shared out there. So Preston evidently has this way of deprogramming people, I guess, because he worked as he was a director at the Montauk Boys Project. So evidently he knows, again, allegedly, he knows how to deprogram people. So he brings Al in, he starts deprogramming him, basically almost like a hypnosis, computer-aided hypnosis. Mm-hmm. He scrapes away all these layers of Al Bielek, and Al Bielek realizes his real name is Edward Cameron. He has a brother named Duncan Cameron. So he starts in these sessions laying out the physics of the Philadelphia experiment, the Tesla coils, the diesel motors, the out-of-phase, in-phase sequencing, how these doctors he worked with, Einstein, Tesla, Van Neumann, and a couple others, were using physics that even him with a PhD in physics had never heard of before.
Right.
And they got a crash course in all this as they worked on this project. But it's only after, again, somebody needs their memories brought forward. Remember, the original Alan had said he'd have to have his memories brought back.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some kind of alleged programming that these people no longer remember this stuff. So Preston Nichols 100%, claims to be this guy who was part of this Montauk project. knew Edward Cameron and Duncan Cameron from when they came through the portal to 1983. He knew other people who allegedly were on the Eldritch during the experiment or were part of the experiment. So he calls somebody who was part of it, says, I want you to talk to somebody. Hands Al Bielek the phone. This gentleman and Al Bielek talk. He hands the phone back to Preston Nichols. Preston Nichols says, do you know Al? And the guy says, I know that voice, but I don't know him as Al Bielek. I know him as Edward Cameron. He was one of the physicists on the project. Right. Knows the voice, does not know the name, Al Bielek. So the deeper they go into Al's repressed memories, the more they find out. So eventually, they come across a man who knows a ton about the Philadelphia experiment, who's now living in like Idaho, Ohio. He comes to one of these, basically Paracon type ufology cons, and kind of walks up to them, starts talking to them, and they realize this guy knows entirely too much, and he knows stuff that Al has only said under regression that has never been released. So Preston asks him about, his involvement. And the guy says, no, I just read all this stuff. And he asked him, would you be willing to undergo a session with me to see if there's more to this? And the guy says, yeah. Well, the guy turns out allegedly to be Duncan Cameron, Edward Cameron's brother. Now, he slowly disappears from the scene after a couple of years. I don't know what his part of it was. I don't know if maybe there were some kind of financial things or something like that, but he stops talking about it. He just disappears back into his normal life. Well, as as Al Bielek is undergoing all this stuff, he claims that somewhere in the 1970s, they developed a technology to take your essence out of your body. And they took his essence out of the body of Edward Cameron and put him in this gentleman, Al Bielek. So he has memories of his childhood as both as Edward Cameron and as Al Bielek.
Right.
So here's the funny thing again. I said this all depends on what time you hear this story. Mm-hmm. I originally heard this story on Coast to Coast AM, where Art Bell interviews Al Bielek. He did about 4 hours of interviews with him over 2 or 3 different phone calls.
Right.
Like I said, the guy explaining the physics of what they did sounds 100% like it was something we would have tried.
Right.
The minds that he claims had worked on this project, it all sounds like stuff that they would have leaned towards working.
Right.
Right. Doesn't necessarily mean that it was the actual project, because there's no connection to Tesla being working on anything in particular. When he was at the Institute of Advanced Science at Princeton, he was just he was never an actual member. He was there. He kind of consulted and walked, had access to stuff, but wasn't necessarily a member. Einstein had worked there. Van Neumann had worked there, but Van Neumann also worked on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bombs. So the timelines don't necessarily add up to him being there in 43. Tesla passed away. I forget what year it was, like 41 or 42. Einstein was working on other stuff. So timelines become shady. But I just finished watching another program with Al Bielek giving a presentation talking about the
Mhm.
Philadelphia experiment. This comes from the 90s. It is on Tubi. It's a three-parter. Preston Nichols, I think, does at least two parts of it. Like I said, my eyes start rolling back in the back of my head when I listen to Preston Nichols describe RF and all this other type signal stuff. Al Bielek at least makes it interesting.
Right.
But in this version of it, there's aliens. We evidently, again, remember I said Tesla claimed to have talked to aliens. The Germans also said they had help from somebody outside of the situation. Allegedly, the aliens had helped us with some of this technology, and the reason they helped us with it and gave us this advanced physics was to open rifts in space time large enough for them to bring their big ships through. So there had to be this 40-year rip in the space time continuum so they could bring through massive ships and large groups of ships. But there was about 3-4 different groups of aliens.
Mm-hmm.
The technology trade is, of course, now here's the one thing that always gets me is, it's we were trading technology with them. They can travel through space. What are we giving them? Blenders? Like food processors,
right,
microwaves? Yeah. Like, these are people that have mastered space travel. They're trading technology with the primitive chimps with guns and projectiles. Like, we are only 100 years into flying at that point, not even 100 years into flying at that point. We are still committing genocide on our own groups of people. We're doing all this nasty stuff. We're also fighting over land and resources. So what are we offering this alien group? So of course there was a non-interference pact allegedly signed between the two groups, that we wouldn't interfere with their society, they wouldn't interfere with our society, but they would give us technology. So according to this, next time I hear this story,
well, maybe they were giving us technology and we were giving them body parts.
Well, see,
maybe that's why the whole abduction. Go ahead.
But see, that's the thing. They say that was one of the things that wasn't part of the original deal.
Oh.
Now, evidently, there was some kind of intergalactic war going on at the same time we're having a world war. So these 3 different alien groups are vying for us or the Germans, or, very elaborate. He gets into this, like, one group was working with us. We actually met with the 2 of the 3 groups, and we chose one of the groups. And that group that we didn't choose actually went to help the Germans, and that's why the Germans did so well technology-wise early in the war. And then eventually, they get us to open this rift in space-time so they can bring their ships through. When their ships come through, evidently the Greys also come through, and that's why we have all the crashes in the late 40s, early 50s. We send out a signal in early 50 something that we have an alien. He's very badly hurt and we don't know what to do. If anybody knows how to fix him, come to us, and we want to help him. So it makes me think of the Roswell crash.
Exactly where my mind went.
Yeah. So allegedly that's how the Greys come. And the Greys evidently come back, and then we make the accord with Eisenhower makes the accord with the in the Air Force Base, and that's when allegedly the abduction phenomenon might have been agreed upon.
Right.
So, depending on what time, which version of this story you hear, again, you now have aliens involved. They help with all this. Well, they needed this riff, and they also needed Montauk to be in existence, the military base, for this mind control project, for other reasons. And by the end of it, the aliens basically dupe us into doing this. Well, Al travels the 2731 or something like that into the future. He's also the one, when you guys all see on Facebook, people share that time traveler says New York City will be underwater in the year whatever. That's the Al Bielek story. The aliens basically used him, sent him to these different points in our time to show him what Earth would be like or could be like. And he was, now this was as Edward Cameron, he went and did all this stuff. This isn't as Al Bielek. So basically, he comes back, and eventually Edward Cameron is allegedly brought up on basically treason. So he's pulled from his research projects. He'd stayed in the military, had moved on different projects and stuff like that after the alleged Philadelphia experiment. Had worked on part of the atomic bomb project allegedly, but had disagreements on fusion with the head scientist on the project. So he was pulled off that, brought up on treason charges. He fully expects to go to a court martial, shows up. He's in a room with like 12 guys. They basically look at him and say, hey, we can't let you continue.
Right.
He says, well, figuring like at that point, what are you going to do? Take me out back, shoot me? And they say, no, we're going to let you live, but you're not going to live as you. This is where this alleged program to take the essence of you out of your body and put it into someone else's body allegedly has been developed. They take him out of his body and put him in the body of Al Bielek. Repress his memories. None of this stuff comes to light until about 1986. Al Bielek and Preston Nichols start uncovering why Al is so interested and seems to have so much knowledge that isn't common knowledge on this subject. And basically he claims he was about to go to bed one night and he was watching HBO and the Philadelphia experiment pops up about to start, and he starts watching it, and he said about 20 minutes into it he realized he's one of those two people in that movie. And he said by the end of the movie he realized he was the other guy, not the star. His brother would have been the star. So that really, like I said, Al Bielek 100% believed until the day he died, when he was giving presentations, that he was Edward Cameron, that all this stuff was true. You read the man's body language, you listen to the stories. Like I said, it wasn't until this other documentary where you got aliens and all this extra tech and stuff like that. The Art Bell 4 or 5 hours that he interviewed him, story never changed. But the one thing I loved about it was, and I've thought about it, I think the application of the Tesla coils would be a very good thing for ghost hunting. It would create extra energy in the air. And I think if you took like 4 Tesla coils to an area that's allegedly haunted and fired them up and took them into like a weird sequencing, you may be able to generate enough energy for something to show itself. So
I would think that would, I think that would be 100% viable. And that's something that I'd really like to try and test if we can get our hands on the right kind of equipment.
Yeah. So, like I said, we were going to talk about some weird stuff. And I mean, we've eaten up most of our hour, or actually the whole hour, with the Philadelphia experiment. But we have a little bit on Operation Paperclip. And the reason I kind of include this, and I'm going to include one other person in all this, is basically we knew there was weird science going on. We knew there were projects that we needed to get before the Russians got. We also knew there was projects that we needed to get before the British got, even though they were our allies. By 43, we realized Russia is the next problem. Britain had realized it much earlier. Poland had said about it the entire time. We realized Russia finally at Malta. FDR finally realized, like, no, Stalin is the next issue. Like, he is going to be a problem. So we started this hunt for German scientists. And the later name for it as the war ends becomes Operation Paperclip, which was just a secret U.S. intelligence program where about 3,200 German scientists, engineers, and techs were taken from Nazi Germany by the U.S. government and then denazified. They became good Germans according to their records and were either brought here to the United States. Well, that's actually what the technical definition was at that point, was good German. They were neither brought here to the U.S., put into projects, hence our NASA. That's one of the NASA logos back there. Our whole entire rocket program was Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi, brought here by paperclip. His brother Magnus, pretty much all the scientists involved in that, very few Americans and none good Germans, as they were called. So this all starts, and this runs from about 45, actually may have started before 45, and runs till about 59 until we track down everybody we want. And some of them are basically deemed by the State Department that, you know, we can't have them in America because at one point one of the doctors is found by a former concentration camp survivor, and this person had basically was a doctor and had basically tortured and mutilated this poor woman. Jeez. And she recognized him. He was on the news or in a newspaper or magazine. Might have been the American Health or American Medical Journal, like magazine at the time, and she realized who it was. He had a different name, but it was him. So she contacted a reporter, I believe it was in Boston or New York, investigating who he was, and they found out who he actually was, and he was, yes, this doctor. So the U.S. State Department had to remove him from the country. But you mentioned Plum Island earlier. Plum Island, the head doctor at Plum Island was the head of Nazi Germany's virology department.
Jesus.
Yeah, he was the head doctor at Plum Island for years. So some of them couldn't actually be brought into the United States, into the actual like mainstream U.S., like couldn't operate. Like if you go to Florida, Melbourne, Cocoa Beach, Satellite Beach, there are tons of German restaurants, ethnic German, like now 3-generation Americanized, but you talk to some of them and like some of the older staff members at like restaurants, and you start talking to them and they're like, oh yeah, I grew up in Germany. You're like, oh, how old are you? And they start saying how old they are, and you're like, oh, what was your dad's name? What project did he work on? And they're all like, oh no, not us. And it's like, no, come on, stop. You live in Melbourne, which was the one of the space, part of the space station, NASA, and you have a German restaurant. You're only 2 generations non-German ethnic, and you're not part of Paperclip. I don't buy it. Also, to give you a reason why it's called Paperclip, it was just because the paperclip they used to attach files together had no special meaning. It was just they used the paperclip to attach these files of these good Germans together, and it just became known as Operation Paperclip.
Huh.
So
it's very scary to think about the number of quote unquote good Germans that came in, at the tail end of the war and after the war, that were the same people that were doing such horrific things and doing all these atrocities that we were fighting against. And it's like, come on over here. Let's try something over here. It's like, we just, did a world war to stop you, but come over here and start adding to that, or try it just a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, some of the worst ones were never brought directly to the U.S., but were put into South America and other areas of the world to be anti-communist government agents. So we funded a lot of anti-communism in South America through bringing in ex-Nazis who were adamant anti-communist. So, that's why Argentina and Brazil and, Paraguay and Uruguay, they have a very high German, Chile, all have very high German concentrations. I mean, Brazil has the second largest immigrant population next to the U.S. But so these guys a lot of them couldn't even come here, but we knew they served a value there. And that's always the weird thing. And I always kind of go back to the question that was posed to like the International Jewish Congress about the medical advancements made by the Nazis during World War II. And I think it was like over 70% of them voted that we should use the technology and the different things they developed, because otherwise the deaths of those people that contributed to the developments was meaningless. And they wanted to find some meaning in those deaths. So they were very big on pushing the fact of like, hey, if it's going to save somebody else, then our people who died to get to that point deserve to know they died for something.
Right.
So that was my little bit on Paperclip, and we're going to try to wrap this up pretty quick here.
Well, part of you mentioned about the one Nazi scientist that came in and worked with NASA. I was just seeing something online the other day about his connection to Walt Disney.
Yeah.
And how Disney was like funding this ex-Nazi, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, they were really good friends. Well, think about where Disney and stuff is. You have Disney in Orlando. You have a ton. I said, think about where Disney is. You have Disney in Orlando. Orlando is less than about an hour drive from Cocoa Beach to Cape Canaveral. Also, allegedly, Walt Disney was a adamant anti-Semite, so he kind of fit the Nazis and their thought process. So yeah, Werner von Braun, Magnus von Braun, all their kids, their wives, they all lived. And I mean, Werner von Braun got he had high German Nazi Germany awards for his work, and then he also got a U.S. national presidential award for his work that he did here. He's buried with honors in a cemetery, stuff like that. So, and we're not the only ones that did this stuff. You had like Operation Backfire, which was a British effort to recover the rockets and the aerospace technology from the Germans. You had a Russian program, Operation Ostkim. It was the Soviet counterpart of Paperclip, involved German technicians, managers, skilled workers, and respective family members who were transferred into the USSR in October of 1946. There was another Operation Sergeant, which was another British post-war program trying to get German aeronautic scientists out of the Soviet Union. Alos, the mission Alos, was one of the early, while the war was still going on, the American, Soviet, and the British effort to capture the Russian nuclear secrets, or excuse me, Russian, German nuclear secrets, equipment, and personnel. If actually you want to pop up that photo of those guys disassembling.
Yep.
So, believe it or not, folks, that is a nuclear reactor, or the beginnings of one. That is a Nazi reactor. The Germans were close to developing nuclear technology. There's a great guy on YouTube and on Facebook, Tino Zuckerman. I'll try to remember to share his link. He actually goes to a lot of the old facilities like Paramunda, Silesia, stuff like that. And he actually goes to these old facilities and talks to the people and tries to figure out how close these different projects were to actually being completed. The Germans started in 1920 something working on nuclear energy. So they definitely were way ahead of us at that point. Now we just happened to get a lot of their scientists that they didn't want because they weren't the right type of people for them. So you can pull that down. Also, he's the one that discovered everybody loves the henge. The henge where they say Die Glocken was kept. Yeah, he's the one that actually figured out what that was. We actually shared his thing about 4 years ago. The henge that everybody thinks was part of the Die Glocken experiment, the teleportation Nazi UFO, was a water tower. It was a cooling tower. He found photos in archives of it filled with water and spent rods in the water cooling. It is the exact henge that everybody thinks is part of this weird science project of the Nazis.
Oh, Jesus.
I don't know. This woman on here keeps hitting on me, though. So there's one last person I want to cover. And the only reason this is really ever came to interest is because I'm always interested in the thought process of hunting Nazis. I would just love to do it. They're just so old nowadays, it wouldn't be that much of a challenge.
Not much of a challenge. Yeah. Knock the cane out from underneath them and you got them.
Yeah. And beat them and torture them. But, turn them over to Israel. Either way.
Yeah.
So there's one. And the weirdest thing about this one is he's probably the one that everybody should have wanted. Except for nobody did. His name's Hans Kammler. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler. And the weird thing was one day I was, I'm very big into history, and I was watching Tino Zuckerman, and he had brought up Hans Kammler and how Hans Kammler was a civil engineer and went through all his schooling, but it was an adamant right-wing National Socialist. And by the end of the war, he had basically become the head of all the Nazis' special weapons and special projects. Basically, his title was Special Projects. He was in charge of von Braun. Actually, by the end of the war, he had basically maneuvered his way past Himmler, who was technically his boss in the SS. He had moved his way past Himmler and was a direct report to Hitler and Albert Speers, and even circumvented Speers's power. Speers was the director of armaments for the Nazi government. He had basically maneuvered his way even past Speers, and he was a direct report to Hitler. So he was in charge of the V2 projects, all the in Upper Silesia, all the underground munitions plants, the aircraft plants, all this. And you got to believe at one point Germany was building airplanes underground in the sides of mountains. Again, go check out Tino Zuckerman's stuff. He goes into all those places. Ex-military, he understands the ground he's looking at, what the uses were, and can kind of build cases for different things like massive power plants, supplying power to places that really don't look like they need massive power plants. Again, trust me, check it out. It's well worth it. So Kammler, at the end of the war, allegedly delivers von Braun and all his group of scientists to what they call the Alpine Redoubt, which is supposed to be the great last stand of Nazi Germany, except for everybody that basically goes there is like, look, this war is over. We just want to be done with it. You know, let's start negotiating our deals with these foreign governments. Because everybody at this point realizes we are in a world of shit. So they all realize whatever skills or whatever they know or knowledge they have, they need to start negotiating. So von Braun right away starts negotiating with the U.S., figures that's my best bet. His whole team, his brother actually, I think, negotiated with the British, but then came with him to America. So Kammler drops them off at the Alpine Redoubt and then basically allegedly leaves and heads to further into the I think it was Czechoslovakia at that point he heads towards. And when he allegedly is either wounded and then commits suicide or decides to just commit suicide somewhere outside of Prague, because Prague is the last Nazi holdout at that point. I mean, there was one other city I think that held out until after the war, but Prague was one of the massive Nazi holdout cities, except for there was an uprising, and you know, by the time they get there, the uprising has taken hold. But allegedly, this is how the story gets cloudy. He dies somewhere in that area, either via suicide or fighting the uprising. And his wife eventually, after a few years, gets the German high courts to declare him dead after the war so she can move on with her life, because she can't get any money. She can't get any of his holdings or anything like that. Can't even apply for any of it. And basically, I guess, couldn't even like remarry if she wanted to, because she's still technically married and he's not dead, according to the government. So she gets him declared dead. And there's nothing really known or heard of him. So I'm watching this video, and then I jump to this, who the hell Hans Kammler is. So I start watching a video about Hans Kammler. Hans Kammler led to the deaths of millions of slave labor people, hundreds of thousands guaranteed, if not millions, of slave labor personnel, which he had privy to because of his position. He basically worked them to death, and when asked about, like, hey, we need to slow down so we don't, overwork them, he basically said, I'll give you more of them. He was notorious for allegedly hanging 6 of them on some underground factory support system. He basically just walked over, grabbed 6 of them, tied ropes around their neck, and cranked them up there himself. But watching this video, they always end the videos with nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows what happened to him. He died somewhere, either in Prague, in a hospital, and is buried anonymously under somebody, or committed suicide on the road to Prague. Well, of course, you start going down these rabbit holes, get about 2-3 videos, and I find this one that has an interview with his former driver. His driver says, oh, we were about here. He walked over there. We buried him over here. Okay. So governments hear this, they find the area, they say, we want the body. Just prove he's dead. We just want to prove he's dead. So they go dig up the whole area, cannot find a body. Find a nurse who has a story that he was in the hospital in a regular German army uniform, had assumed a name, an identification disc from an assumed name, and basically died from wounds and is buried in the cemetery in this area. Can't find any name that matches the name she gives. On this video, there's a comment. It says, my grandfather's name was Hans Kammler. He died in Pennsylvania in 1996. So, of course, hey, I'd like to talk to you about that. What area? Never got a response. Well, guys have been doing research on Hans Kammler for years. There's a book out there called America's Deal with the Devil. The story of how we got Hans Kammler. Hans Kammler ran all these programs, so therefore Hans Kammler knew what programs were actually working, where they were, and how to pressure the doctors into working harder. He also knew what projects were just ways of funneling money from the government to private accounts. So we basically captured him at some point, or he surrendered. He actually evidently started negotiating with us in 1944, not at the end of the war. He started actually, Himmler also, and Goering and all of them started negotiating a long time before the war was over to try to get, some of them believe that if the Germans could negotiate a peace with Britain and America, we would join their war against Russia. And they felt like if that happened, they would stay in power in Germany. It would still be Nazi Germany. We'd all join sides, get rid of Russia, get rid of communism, and then go back to the status quo of this is Nazi Germany, which is now Nazi Europe. Britain is Britain. France can be negotiated on later. They had the Vichy government at that point. Fine. Japan, going to lose the war eventually anyway, so it would tie up less Americans in Europe. So they all started these negotiation ploys. Well, Kammler evidently negotiated his way secretly into the U.S., so secretly that there's never a paperclip file on him. There's really no files until a man says, oh, my dad worked for the Joint Intelligence Organization, JOA, at the end of World War II, and he was the one that interviewed Kammler after the war when he was being held at this prison. So, of course, the story is he was held in a prison, and then he was neither committed suicide in the prison or was killed in the prison. Well, they started to do more research. Nothing really leads to him dying in that prison, and yet does lead to him working for the U.S. government at some point on certain projects. Also, like I said earlier, Pennsylvania does have a high German population. There were always people like that my grandfather would point out that were definitely ethnic Germans that lived in the valley and then down towards Indiantown Gap, which was also a prison camp at one point, down in towards Columbia and stuff like that. So I wouldn't doubt Hans Kammler did not live in the United States until 96 when he passed away, and probably lived in Pennsylvania at that point and passed away. But yet, yeah, nobody kept a file on him. Like, he should have been one of the most wanted Nazis due to his knowledge. If you were going after a paperclip ploy, his knowledge of the projects, his knowledge of engineering, who, what, the fact that he was, the boss to all these people, somehow maneuvered his way around Spears, maneuvered his way around Himmler and Goering, and somehow he just slipped through the cracks allegedly and just, according to history, died on a road outside of Prague. Yet we've now found documentation that the U.S. had him. Not sure what all he did for the U.S., but yeah. So my Hans Klum.
Now, this dude had many suicide attempts, didn't he?
He
killed
just
himself on the road in Prague, killed himself in prison.
Yeah, committed suicide. In fighting the uprising, committed suicide in prison. But
Lord.
yeah, I mean, one of those.
Still just blows my mind how many of these freaking Nazis ended up coming into the United States. I mean, this, like you said, dude, this dude was huge.
Yeah, 3,200 confirmed ex-Nazis that were brought through paperclip to the U.S. That doesn't include probably about 6,000 total. 3,200 brought into the U.S.
Jesus.
Plus the ones we sent to South America, the ones we kept in Europe. I mean, even Israel, after it was established as its own independent country, did deals with ex-Nazis and used them. They used ex-Nazis to hunt other Nazis. So, I mean, these people had values to these other countries in some way, shape, or form. I mean, the Russians took. If we took somewhere between 3,200 into the U.S. and 6,000 total between us and the British, the Russians probably took 12,000. And at that point, it was to get when asked why we won the space race, people are often noted as saying because our Nazi, or I think it was Bob Hope said it, because our Nazis were better than the Russian Nazis. And that's what it was. We got von Braun, and von Braun had the rocket technology, and his staff came with him. So we had we had a guy from the 1920s who had been envisioning rockets into space and testing and learning and developing this whole project. And the problem a lot of times with science is military will take science and use it for what it can be used for before it ever gets into civilian hands, and that's the V2 rocket. The V2 rocket was what eventually terrorized England and stuff like that, and they were working on V2s that could hit America, but it's also what led us to being able to get to the moon. So but yeah, I mean, we took a whole bunch of them. Great book if you have time. You can get it on audiobook. Annie Jacobs, her Operation Paperclip book is really good. I've listened to it a few times. It's probably like 24 hours worth of audio. I've listened to it in sections, but she actually went and met with like the children of some of these doctors and stuff like that weren't necessarily brought out of Germany but were kept safe in Germany and kept working. She actually was given one of the guys all his files and stuff like that from Nazi Germany, all his awards. Problem is, in Germany you can't have swastikas, you can't have any reference to the Nazi regime. She had to go through customs. The guy's son said, "I don't want these. You'd probably do better having them. It would give you better stuff for your book." And she's like, "Oh, I can't take them. They're your father's." He's like, "I don't want them." And he gave her all these books. Well, she had to go fly home that next, like from there, drive to the airport and fly home. So she was trying to go through customs with all these Nazi logoed, swastika logoed pieces of material. They never stopped her, thankfully, I guess, because she was leaving the country with them. But Yeah, so her book is really good, and she's been on Rogan. She actually talks about her paperclip book on with Rogan and stuff like that. It's pretty
I
interesting.
heard the interview with him and
Yeah.
her, and it was freaking awesome. I think
Yeah, I
we
guess-
talked about that one.
Yeah, I think so.
Not on the show, but just
Yeah.
you know. And Cindy brings up a good point of how von Braun was important to our space program at the time, and it's interesting how they seem to have. And this I concur with her. It's interesting how the Nazi Germany seemed to have so much more knowledge than everybody else at that time. It's like, and again, there's so many conspiracies about alien influence and this, that, and the other thing. We mentioned it earlier. And, it makes a lot of sense because they were at such a different point than everybody else at that time, and some of the stuff that they were coming up with was just insane. But did they make a battleship disappear? That's the big question.
Well, also you got to think
Beat them
about
to the punch on that.
yeah, the whole thing about them being ahead of us. They're a precision culture. Precision machinery. That's what Germany is known for, is the precision machinery, the craftsmanship, stuff like that. You also have, like I said, von Braun started working on rockets as a child in the 20s, just launching them, like kids buy them at Hobby Lobby now and can shoot them up in the air. He was doing that stuff as a child, joining the rocket club, and by the time he was 20 something and in college, he had already had this advanced knowledge of aeronautics. So you also got to think about it. Forward thinking. Again, like I said, military use. A government who is planning on taking they feel is theirs, destroying a group of people, enslaving other groups of people, are going to fund people who have a military application to what they work on.
Right.
Von Braun, his whole thing was, I just wanted to do rockets. I wanted to go to space. That was my goal, was space travel and or intercontinental travel via space, and being able to do this, go from Europe to Asia in minutes and America in minutes. And the Nazis took my thought process and paid me a lot of money to make things that I thought were going to be used for that were later just used to bomb countries.
Right.
And they weren't that successful. I mean, don't get me wrong, people in London would probably disagree in the nights the V2s hit, but they weren't successful in the sense of they really didn't kill that many people. They didn't stop the war. They couldn't fire them easily on the continent, at the continent. If they would have had the technology that, sometimes we think they had, do you think the Russians would have taken Berlin? From 43 to 45 is all it took from Russia, from getting their teeth kicked, that the Germans were on the Volga River, actually at the river, past the river in some spots, outside of Moscow in 1943. And by 1945, the Russians were in Berlin. So the technology that I think sometimes we subscribe to them is a little bit greater than what it really was.
Yeah.
But yeah, the knowledge of these people, though, but also think about it. Think of the scientists we got because of them being Jewish. Mm-hmm. Einstein, a couple other ones. Von Neumann, I think, might have been Jewish, but he grew up in Germany or Poland. We got a lot of the scientists we had from over there because they saw what was coming, but also America wasn't. We're blood and guts, meat and potatoes.
Yeah.
We were worried about creating better tanks, not jet engines. We were get on the ground, punch them in the face, fighters. They were also, you're looking at a smaller country with a smaller group of people trying to fight bigger countries. They need all the technology advantages. So they're going to spend money on them. They're going to spend money on those research projects. And like I said, a lot of those research projects, when you actually start looking and listening to what Spears said, a lot of those projects, they knew were going to fail day one, but Hitler heard it, thought it would be the Wunder weapons, and spent millions of Reichmarks on people they knew were never going to produce anything, but they were going to get rich in the process. So that is the end of what I have.
Well, that was awesome. That was a lot of information to take in on a very wish-washy, I guess, kind of topic, because some of the stories that I had heard about the Philadelphia experiment differed slightly, I would say, from a lot of the stuff that you had said. Now, the alien aspect of this was new to me. I didn't hear a lot about the alien interactions with some of the research that I had done on the Philadelphia project. I saw that video from the early 90s where he said about they traveled, obviously through hyperspace on the ship. The two guys jumped off, got disintegrated. They jumped off, landed in Montauk. And then they were talking about it was August 12th. That was the big day. And it was, I guess, the
Earth's biorhythms.
Yeah, we're more sensitive every 20 years on the 12th of August. And then every 10 years, there was enough to open a rift, but it was every 20 years where it was strongest. And I guess they were able to get all the way up to 2003, I think they said, but supposedly they couldn't go beyond 2013 because there was some sort of a time travel wall that they couldn't go beyond 2013. And I think they were saying that, if I remember correctly, when they came through in 83, in order to send them back, they had basically Tesla's coil in a radio tower form that was able to reopen the portal in, I guess, along the wall of one of their rooms, and that they were in, and they were sent back to the battleship through that hole in the wall. And they said that they were kept in that specific room because they couldn't interact with their future selves.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point too, they were saying about how the people that were in the body of the ship were safer than the people that were on the deck because of the steel walls. But a lot of the people went mad and were, like you said, fused into the metal of the ship. That had to be something to see. People just like stuck into these steel walls and whatnot, and basically become part of that ship.
Mm-hmm.
So again, to your point, I mean, there's a lot of holes, a lot of red flags, and it's a great story for movies and novels. Like you're talking about in the beginning of the show, how a lot of it was revolving around books and authors and all different kinds of subjects, from extraterrestrial to the extraordinary and science fiction and whatnot. So is it a really great story to back a book? Who knows? But interesting nonetheless, if this actually did happen. So I want to thank you for sure for putting all this together, because I really had I was no help to this show whatsoever. I was really looking forward to this one though, because it's just such an interesting topic. But I guess before we officially end the show, I do have to give our ending spiel.
Oh, hold on 1 second. 1 second.
Sure.
Did government come in and take all of his paperwork when he died? If you're referring to Tesla, yes. And the funniest thing is the whole thing with Tesla dying is he supposedly died broke and he had 86 chests of patents and designs. Well, the modern conspiracy on all this is, and part of this comes from a true point, is Donald Trump's uncle was the lead FBI agent sent to take Tesla's 86 trunks and secure them. Then he's the one who gets all the information. And the funny thing is there's the book from like 1896, Baron Trump's Underground Adventures. Well, Donald's last son's name is Baron Trump. So the conspiracy now is Baron Trump is actually a time traveler, because the book from 1896, the Baron Trump's Underground Adventures, is actually Baron Trump in that book is a time traveler. So that's the conspiracy, the new modern conspiracy everyone's throwing. Baron Trump's a time traveler because Donald Trump's uncle was the one who secured Tesla's information. Tesla felt he could bend time. So therefore, Baron Trump is a time traveler.
I love that story.
That is the closest you'll ever hear us get political.
Yeah, that's right. Didn't wasn't one of the things that kind of destroyed Tesla was he actually figured out how to draw electricity from the atmosphere, so there would be like no need for burning coal or any other kind of fossil fuels to generate electricity, and basically be free for everybody. Like there'd be no profit in it. That you'd just be able to draw, electricity. That wasn't the DC current, was it? No,
AC/DC is the alternating and direct current. So two different forms of delivery. But yeah, he did figure out a way to transmit electricity, without having to pay for it.
Right.
He actually set up, there was one, I think it was in New Jersey they had set up, and it had worked. Mm-hmm. And of course it got destroyed randomly because Edison didn't like that idea, because Edison wanted to make money off of electricity.
Oh my gosh. Well, anyways, I'm going to do our ending now. Do you have anything else to add in, or are you good? Good?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Swallow. All right. For those of you still here, and for those of you who might be tuning in later, you can watch us live every other Tuesday on YouTube and Facebook. While you're there, follow us on Facebook, like and subscribe on YouTube. You can find us at our website at explorersgroup.com, on Twitter or X at Explorers Group. And we are on all the major podcasting platforms out there. So while you're there listening and hopefully enjoying our show, give us a 5-star review to help boost us in all those rankings and algorithms and all that other fun stuff. So again, Chad, thank you so much for putting this show together tonight. It was awesome. Everybody, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for the interaction as always. We'll be back hopefully in another 2 weeks. I know we were supposed to go live last week, but just life, back to school, work, all that crap kind of collided at one time. And but here we are. We made it. We made it live. So 2 weeks from now, we're going to go live again. And as we say every week, any topic anybody wants us to talk about, please get message us on YouTube or Facebook. That's probably the best way to get in touch with us, and let us know what you want to hear. We greatly appreciate it. So until then, good night, everybody. And Chad, thank you so much again. It was a great show, and good night, brother.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.